In a cramped Portland studio apartment, a struggling graphic designer was about to discover that her malfunctioning standing desk held secrets spanning 7 decades. What started as morning frustration with broken office equipment took a shocking turn when she came face to face with the translucent figure of a 1950s architect. Sarah White wasn't your typical tenant-turned-landlord. When she encountered Harold Pemberton adjusting her desk in the pre-dawn darkness, she had no idea she was walking into a supernatural partnership that would transform an entire building and restore a fractured family legacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah White's alarm buzzed at 6:47 a.m., 3 minutes before she'd actually programmed it, because even her cheap digital clock seemed determined to betray her. She rolled out of bed with the mechanical precision of someone who'd perfected the art of existing on autopilot, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood of her studio apartment with a soft thud that echoed through the cramped space. The standing desk waited for her like a daily accusation. There it was again, her one significant purchase, her investment in her future health, her $1,000 solution to 3 years of chronic back pain, sitting at its lowest setting like a deflated balloon. The black motorized frame crouched close to the floor, its sleek surface mocking her as she stood there in yesterday's oversized t-shirt and sleep-wrinkled leggings. Every single morning, Sarah muttered, dropping to her hands and knees with a grunt that revealed more about her 28-year-old body than she cared to acknowledge. The manual adjustment lever had somehow migrated to the back corner again, as if it actively tried to hide from her searching fingers. The metal was cold against her palm as she cranked it counterclockwise, listening to the familiar whir of gears that shouldn't need to engage if the electric motor worked properly. The desk rose with jerky, reluctant movements, like an old man getting out of bed. Sarah's lower back twinged in sympathy, or maybe in protest of her own morning contortions. She'd bought this desk specifically to avoid the hunched-over posture that had plagued her since college, but every morning began with her crawling around on the floor like she was searching for lost contact lenses. As the desk reached its proper height, Sarah caught her reflection in the black screen of her laptop. Her dark blonde hair stuck up at odd angles, and the shadows under her green eyes spoke of another night where she'd stayed up too late tweaking client logos for rates that barely covered her rent. She looked exactly like what she was, a freelance graphic designer living paycheck to paycheck in a building that seemed held together by stubbornness and decades-old paint. The radiator in the corner hissed to life with a sound like an angry cat, joining the morning symphony of the Pemberton building. Through her thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Santos from 1A running water, the pipes groaning in response. Someone upstairs, probably that odd guy in 2B who always seemed to be awake, was moving around with the careful steps of someone trying not to disturb neighbors. A door slammed somewhere below, followed by the distinctive wheeze of the building's ancient elevator lurching into motion. Sarah had lived here for 3 years and could map her neighbors' routines by sound alone, yet she couldn't remember the last time she'd had an actual conversation with any of them. They were just the ambient noise of her existence, like traffic. Or the hum of the refrigerator, present but not really acknowledged. She opened her laptop and navigated to her bank account with the reluctant determination of someone checking a suspicious mole. The numbers glowed back at her in their unforgiving digital font, $847.32, rent was due in 6 days. The client who'd promised payment by last Friday had gone radio silent. The logo design she'd submitted to the boutique downtown had been met with a request for something more dynamic, code for, we want to pay you less for more work. Sarah closed the laptop harder than necessary and reached for her phone, scrolling through the familiar cascade of bills, client emails, and notifications. From apps designed to remind her how behind she was on everything. A voicemail from her mother waited like a small red landmine, probably another invitation to come home and help with the restaurant, that translated to give up your dreams and do what we want. The building settled around her with its usual collection of creaks and sighs. Someone was playing music downstairs, something with a lot of guitar that filtered up through the floorboards. The elevator wheezed past her floor, carrying someone to the upper levels she rarely visited. For a building that was supposedly home to a dozen people, it felt remarkably empty most of the time. The knock at her door came so unexpectedly that Sarah actually jumped, her phone clattering onto the desk surface. She wasn't expecting anyone. The UPS driver usually just left packages in the lobby, and her few friends knew better than to show up unannounced before noon. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in a crisp navy suit holding a leather briefcase. The stranger looked official. In a way that made Sarah's stomach clench, the kind of official that usually meant someone wanted money she didn't have or signatures on documents she couldn't afford to sign. Sarah White, the woman asked when Sarah opened the door, keeping the chain latch engaged. I'm Margaret Chen from Clearwater and Associates. I'm here regarding the estate of Eleanor Vasquez. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Eleanor, Mrs. Vasquez, their landlord. The tiny, fierce woman who'd rented Sarah this apartment 3 years ago with nothing more than a handshake and an intuitive assessment of character. Sarah had seen her maybe a dozen times since then, usually in the lobby collecting mail or chatting with other tenants who seemed to know her much better. Is she? Sarah's voice caught. What happened? May I come in? This is rather sensitive information. Sarah's hands shook as she undid the chain. Margaret Chen stepped into the studio with the careful politeness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news in small spaces. Her eyes took in the converted office space, the exposed brick walls, the high windows that never quite let in enough light, the careful arrangement of furniture that made 400 square feet feel almost livable. Mrs. Vasquez passed away peacefully last Tuesday, Margaret said, settling onto Sarah's thrift store couch with practiced ease. I'm sorry for your loss. She spoke of you often. Sarah blinked. She did? You're named in her will, Miss White. As her primary beneficiary, actually. The words seemed to arrive from very far away, like a radio signal struggling through static. Sarah found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, the only other seating option in the studio, staring at the lawyer as if she might suddenly start speaking a language Sarah recognized. I'm sorry, what? Margaret opened her briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times. Eleanor Vasquez has left you the Pemberton building in its entirety. The property, all current rental agreements, and, she consulted a document, a small savings account to help with immediate expenses. The standing desk seemed to tilt in Sarah's peripheral vision. The building? This building? Yes. She was quite specific about her choice. According to her notes, she believed you had the right kind of eyes, whatever that means. She also mentioned something about potential you hadn't recognized in yourself yet. Sarah's mouth opened and closed. Without producing sound. Eleanor had barely spoken to her beyond polite hallway greetings. How could she have seen any potential? How could she have seen anything at all? Miss White? Are you all right? I don't understand. Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. She has family, doesn't she? Other people who actually knew her? Margaret's expression softened slightly. She has relatives, yes. But she was very clear about her decision. She left them some personal items and smaller bequests, but the building goes to you. She included a letter. The envelope Margaret handed her was cream-colored and heavy, with Sarah's name written in Eleanor's distinctive spidery handwriting. Sarah's fingers traced the letters as if they might reveal their secrets through touch alone. Through her windows, the building seemed to exhale around them. The pipes gurgled. Someone's footsteps echoed in the hallway. The elevator wheezed past again, carrying another neighbor Sarah had never really met to another floor she'd never really explored. All of it, every creak, every pipe, every tenant with their own story and struggles, apparently belonged to her now. There are documents to sign, of course, Margaret was saying, and we'll need to schedule a meeting to go over the financial details, the current rental agreements, property taxes. But Sarah was staring at the letter in her hands, wondering how someone she'd barely known could have seen something in her that she'd never seen in herself. The standing desk caught her eye, still at its perfect height, still working exactly as it should after her morning battle with the manual controls. For the first time since she'd moved into the Pemberton building, Sarah wondered what secrets it might be keeping. Sarah's fingers still trembled as she turned Eleanor's letter over in her hands, but Margaret Chen's expectant silence demanded immediate attention. The cream-colored envelope felt impossibly heavy, like it contained more than just paper and ink, as if Eleanor's final words carried the weight of the entire building pressing down on Sarah's shoulders. I'll need time to process this, Sarah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course. But there are some immediate concerns. Margaret pulled out a thick manila folder. The building has 8 occupied units, and Mrs. Vasquez handled all tenant relations personally. They'll need to know about the transition. 8 occupied units. Sarah had assumed the building was mostly empty, given how quiet it usually seemed. The realization that she was suddenly responsible for 8 households, 8 lives, made her stomach lurch. What am I supposed to tell them? The truth is usually best. But first, you should probably introduce yourself properly. Margaret's smile was kind but businesslike. According to the records, some tenants haven't seen a rent increase in over 5 years. Mrs. Vasquez was generous with her pricing. After Margaret left with promises to call about paperwork appointments, Sarah sat in her studio staring at the folder of tenant agreements. Each file contained a story she'd never bothered to learn, rent amounts that seemed impossibly low for downtown Portland, handwritten notes in Eleanor's spidery script about payment plans and temporary hardships, photocopied lease agreements that some tenants had been renewing for over a decade. The weight of it all pressed against her chest like a physical thing. These people had trusted Eleanor, had built their lives around her fairness and stability. Now they had Sarah, a woman who could barely manage her own finances, who hid in her apartment to avoid small talk, who had never been responsible for anything more significant than her own freelance deadlines. A sharp knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. This time, she recognized the rhythm, Mrs. Santos from 1A, the same purposeful rap she heard every morning when someone knocked on doors throughout the building. Sarah opened her door to find a compact woman in her 40s with steel-gray streaks in her black hair and eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything they saw. Rosario Santos stood with her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between concern and suspicion. "So it's true," Rosario said without preamble. "Eleanor left. You the building. You heard about that fast. Nothing stays secret here long." Rosario's gaze flicked past Sarah into the studio, taking in the sparse furniture and the standing desk that dominated the small space. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." Sarah stepped aside, suddenly hyper-aware of how little she knew about the woman who'd apparently been managing the building's day-to-day operations. Rosario moved into the space with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking charge. "First things first," Rosario said, settling onto the couch without invitation. "What are your intentions? Selling? Raising rents? Kicking people out to renovate?" "I don't know." The honesty felt inadequate. "I just found out an hour ago." Rosario's expression softened slightly, but her posture remained guarded. "Eleanor talked about you sometimes. Said you reminded her of herself when she was young, too stubborn to ask for help, too proud to admit when you're struggling." "She barely knew me." Eleanor knew everyone in this building better than they knew themselves. It was her gift. Rosario's voice carried a mixture of affection and grief. "She saw things others missed. But seeing potential and knowing what to do with it are different skills entirely." Sarah sank into her desk chair, feeling the familiar comfort of the properly adjusted height. "What am I supposed to do? I don't know anything about being a landlord. I can barely manage my own rent. Eleanor's records show the building breaks even most months, sometimes runs a small profit. But there's a list of repairs as long as my arm, and the heating system is held together with prayer and duct tape." Rosario pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a long note file. "I've been keeping track for years." The list was daunting. Roof leaks, electrical updates, plumbing issues, elevator maintenance that was overdue by 6 months. Each item represented hundreds or thousands of dollars Sarah didn't have. "Why did she do this?" Sarah asked. "Why me?" Before Rosario could answer, another knock echoed through the studio. This time it was accompanied by an enthusiastic voice calling, "Sarah? Are you in there? It's Toby from 2B. Sarah exchanged glances with Rosario, who rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "That's our resident conspiracy theorist. He's harmless, but he talks a lot." Tobias Kim practically bounced into the studio when Sarah opened the door. Thin and animated, with thick-rimmed glasses and hair that suggested he'd been running his hands through it, he looked like he'd just discovered something miraculous. "I can't believe Eleanor actually did it," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "I mean, I hypothesized about it in my notes, but I never thought she'd really leave the building to someone. Well, not someone random. You're not random, obviously. She chose you specifically, which means she saw something, and Eleanor always saw things others missed, which is probably why she knew about Toby." Rosario interrupted gently. "Breathe. Right, sorry. I get excited about patterns and connections." Toby pushed his glasses up his nose. "I've been documenting anomalies in this building for 3 years. Electromagnetic fluctuations, temperature variations, sounds that don't have obvious sources. Eleanor knew about all of it." Sarah felt a familiar skepticism rising. "Anomalies? Your desk, for instance." Toby pointed at the standing desk with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a major discovery. "It resets every night, doesn't it? Same time, same position. I've been tracking it." The words hit Sarah like cold water. "You've been watching my apartment?" "Not watching, monitoring. There's a difference. I have sensors throughout the building, with Eleanor's permission, of course. Your desk isn't malfunctioning. Something is deliberately adjusting it." Rosario sighed. "Toby thinks the building is haunted. I don't think, I have data." Toby's voice took on the passionate intensity of someone whose theories were finally being taken seriously. "Temperature drops, electromagnetic spikes, sounds that register on recording equipment but not to human ears. This building has been exhibiting paranormal activity for decades." Sarah looked between them, Rosario's practical skepticism and Toby's fervent conviction. A week ago, her biggest concern had been making rent. Now she was apparently the owner of a potentially haunted building with 8 tenants, dozens of expensive repairs, and a mystery involving her standing desk. "There's someone else you should meet," Rosario said, standing. "Felix in 3B has been here longer than anyone except Eleanor. He might have answers." They found Felix Martinez in the hallway outside his apartment, applying careful brushstrokes to a mural that Sarah had never really noticed before. The elderly man worked with the focused concentration of someone for whom art was both passion and meditation. His weathered hands moved the brush with surprising steadiness, adding delicate details to what appeared to be a historical scene of the building itself. "Ah, the new landlord," Felix said without turning around. His voice carried a slight accent and the warmth of someone comfortable with himself. "Eleanor said you had good eyes." "I see she was right." "What do you mean?" Felix stepped back from his work, and Sarah gasped. The mural wasn't just decorative, it was a detailed historical timeline of the building, showing its transformation through different eras. In one section, she could see the building as it must have looked in the 1920s, pristine and new. In another, it showed the renovations of the 1950s, with workers in period clothing installing modern fixtures. "Eleanor wasn't the first to see potential in overlooked people," Felix said. "This building has always been a haven for those who needed a second chance. Artists, immigrants, people starting over. That's its real value, not the real estate, but the community." Sarah studied the mural more closely and noticed something that made her breath catch. In the 1950s section, she could see a man working late at a drafting table in what looked like her apartment, surrounded by architectural plans and empty coffee cups. "Who is that?" she asked, pointing to the figure. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Felix's expression grew thoughtful. Someone who cared about this building very much. Someone who never got to finish what he started. As if summoned by their conversation, a series of sounds echoed through the building, pipes settling, the elevator groaning to life without being called, and somewhere above them, the unmistakable sound of furniture being moved across a floor. Toby pulled out his phone, eyes bright with vindication. "Electromagnetic spike," he announced. "Right on schedule." Sarah looked around at her new tenants, Rosario's protective pragmatism, Toby's enthusiastic theories, Felix's gentle wisdom, and realized that inheriting the building was just the beginning. She hadn't just become a landlord, she'd become the keeper of a mystery that somehow connected her standing desk to the building's hidden history. Eleanor's letter remained unopened. In her pocket, its secrets waiting to be revealed. But first, Sarah needed to understand exactly what she'd inherited, and why her simple desk problem might be the key to something much larger than she'd ever imagined. Eleanor's letter remained unopened in her pocket, its secrets waiting to be revealed. But first, Sarah needed to understand exactly what she'd inherited, and why her simple desk problem might be the key to something much larger than she'd ever imagined. That evening, Sarah sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at the standing desk as if it might suddenly reveal its secrets. The conversations with her tenants, she still couldn't wrap her mind around that, had left her with more questions than answers. Toby's talk of electromagnetic spikes and deliberate adjustments seemed impossible, but his certainty had been unsettling. And Felix's mural, with that mysterious figure working late into the night. She tried to focus on client work, but every time she settled at her desk, she found herself distracted by its perfect height, wondering what invisible hands would lower it again while she slept. The rational part of her mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation, a timer malfunction, a weight-triggered reset, something mechanical and explainable. But the building around her seemed to hum with hidden activity as evening deepened into night. Pipes gurgled in patterns that didn't match anyone running water. The elevator made its wheezating journey between floors without being summoned. And somewhere in the walls themselves, she could swear she heard the faint scratching of pencil on paper, like someone drafting plans in the darkness. By 11 p.m., Sarah had made her decision. If something was interfering with her desk, she was going to catch it in the act. She arranged herself on the couch with a clear view of the desk, laptop balanced on her knees and a cup of coffee growing cold on the side table. The building settled around her with its usual symphony of creaks and sighs, but tonight she listened with new attention. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more pronounced. At 11:47 p.m., according to the clock on her laptop, the temperature in her studio dropped 10 degrees in the span of 30 seconds. Sarah pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching her breath mist in the suddenly frigid air. The coffee cup on her table began to fog over, condensation beating on its surface like tears. She reached for her phone to document what was happening, but her fingers moved sluggishly, as if the cold had thickened the very air around her. That's when she saw him. A figure materialized near her desk, not appearing all at once, but becoming gradually visible like a photograph. Developing in slow motion. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, that the combination of exhaustion and stress had finally pushed her over the edge into hallucination. But as the figure solidified, she could make out distinct details: a man in his 30s wearing a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark trousers held up by suspenders, and thick-rimmed glasses that caught the streetlight filtering through her windows. He moved with purpose and familiarity, circling her desk like a craftsman examining his work. His hands, translucent but somehow solid, ran along the surface, testing its stability. He frowned at the modern electronics, poking tentatively at her laptop as if he'd never seen anything like it before. Sarah's rational mind screamed that this couldn't be happening, but her body remained frozen in place, whether from fear or cold or simple disbelief. The figure seemed entirely focused on his task, muttering under his breath in words she couldn't quite make out. He crouched beside the desk's base, examining the motorized mechanism with the concentrated attention of someone diagnosing a problem. "This isn't right," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the frigid air despite its ethereal quality. "The proportions are all wrong. How is anyone supposed to work at this height?" Sarah watched in fascination and terror as the ghostly figure, because what else could he be, began manually adjusting her desk. His movements were practiced, efficient, like someone who'd performed the same task countless times before. The desk lowered smoothly under his ministrations, far more smoothly than it ever moved for Sarah during her morning battles with the manual controls. "Much better," he said with satisfaction, stepping back to admire his work. "Proper ergonomics are essential for productivity. Can't have people hunching over their work like." He stopped mid-sentence, his translucent eyes meeting Sarah's across the room. For a moment, they stared at each other in mutual shock. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs as she sat frozen on her couch. "You can see me," he said, his voice filled with wonder and confusion. Sarah tried to speak, but only managed a strangled squeak. The figure, the ghost, took a step toward her, his expression shifting from surprise to something like relief. "I'm not imagining this," he continued, more to himself than to her. "You're actually looking at me. It's been so long since anyone could see me. Well, except for Eleanor, but she could see everyone. That was her gift." "You're dead," Sarah finally managed to whisper. "Well, yes, technically." He adjusted his glasses in a gesture that seemed entirely too human for a supernatural entity. "Though I prefer to think of it as indefinitely delayed departure. I have work to finish, you see. Can't leave a job half done." Sarah's grip tightened on her laptop. "You've been adjusting my desk." "Of course. It's completely wrong for productive work. The height is all off, the angle doesn't promote proper posture, and don't get me started on the positioning relative to the windows. Natural light is crucial for detailed work." He gestured enthusiastically, warming to his subject. "I've been trying to correct these problems for months, but you keep changing it back. It's supposed to be that height. It's a standing desk." The ghost, she was apparently having a conversation with a ghost, looked genuinely puzzled. "Standing? While working? That's preposterous. How can anyone concentrate while standing? The human body needs proper support for sustained intellectual effort." Despite her terror, Sarah found herself fighting back an inappropriate laugh. "What year do you think this is?" 1953, of course. Though I've been having some trouble with the calendars lately. They keep showing impossible dates." He paused, studying her more carefully. "You're dressed rather unusually for a young lady. And that contraption you're holding?" "It's 2025, Sarah said gently. "You've been delayed for 72 years. The information hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his form flickering like a candle in the wind. 72 years? But I only just started the renovation plans. Mr. Pemberton hired me to modernize the building, bring it up to contemporary standards. I can't have been working on them for 72 years. "Mr. Pemberton?" "The building owner. Harold Pemberton. He wanted to preserve the original character while updating the infrastructure. It's delicate work, requiring attention to every detail." The ghost's form began to solidify again as he focused on familiar territory. "I've been working nights to perfect the plans, but there's so much to consider. Electrical updates, plumbing improvements, making sure each apartment maintains its unique character while meeting modern standards." Sarah's mind raced. "You're Harold Pemberton." "Well, yes. Though I don't understand why you seem surprised by that." He looked around the studio with fresh eyes, taking in details he'd apparently missed before. "This used to be my office. Where are my drafting tables? My blueprints? The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. You died here. At your desk, working on renovation plans for the building. Harold's expression crumpled as the weight of decades settled on his translucent shoulders. I remember feeling tired. It was very late, and I'd been working for hours. I thought I'd just rest my eyes for a moment. He touched the space where his heart would be. I had so much left to do. The building needed those improvements. The tenants deserved better. Sarah watched compassion war with fear in her chest. This wasn't some malevolent spirit or vengeful ghost from a horror movie. This was a man who'd died with unfinished business, who'd been trying to complete his work for 7 decades without realizing he was no longer alive. The building has been fine, she said softly. People have been living here, making it their home. Eleanor took care of everyone. Eleanor? Harold's face brightened. The young woman who could see me? She's been helping with the building maintenance? Sarah's heart clenched as she realized she'd have to deliver more devastating news. But before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her apartment, followed by an urgent knocking at her door. Sarah. Toby's voice carried through the thin wood. Are you okay? I'm reading massive electromagnetic activity from your apartment. Harold's form began to fade as his attention scattered. Someone's coming. I should go. But we need to talk. More about the renovation plans. There's so much work left to do. Wait, Sarah started, but Harold was already dissolving back into the cold air, leaving only the lingering scent of old coffee and pencil shavings. The temperature in her studio began to return to normal as Toby's knocking became more insistent. Sarah stood on shaking legs, her mind reeling from the encounter. She had a ghost. Her building, was haunted by its former architect, a man who'd been trying to finish renovation plans for over 70 years. And somehow, impossibly, she was going to have to figure out how to help him find peace. And somehow, impossibly, she was going to have to figure out how to help him find peace. Sarah opened her door to find Toby standing in the hallway with what looked like a handheld electromagnetic field detector, its screen pulsing with readings that made his eyes bright with vindication. Behind his thick glasses, his expression mixed concern with barely contained excitement. The readings spiked off the charts about 20 minutes ago, he said, pushing past her into the studio without invitation. Temperature dropped, electromagnetic activity went crazy, and then, he stopped mid-sentence, staring at her standing desk. It's been adjusted again, hasn't it? Sarah looked at the desk, now sitting at its familiar low position after Harold's nighttime repairs. The rational part of her mind suggested she should deny everything, dismiss Toby's theories as the ravings of a conspiracy theorist. But the lingering scent of old coffee and pencil shavings made that impossible. Toby, she said carefully, hypothetically speaking, if someone told you they'd just had a conversation with a ghost, what would you say? Toby's entire face lit up like Christmas morning. I'd say, finally, and ask if you got his name. Harold Pemberton. The electromagnetic detector slipped from Toby's hands, clattering to the floor. You actually saw him? And he talked to you? What did he look like? What did he say? Did he mention the renovation plans? Sarah sank onto her couch, suddenly exhausted. He thinks it's still 1953. He's been trying to fix my desk because he doesn't understand modern ergonomics. And he mentioned renovation plans, but he seemed confused about time. This is incredible. Toby began pacing her small studio with manic energy. I've been documenting his presence for 3 years, but he's never been this coherent, never manifested visually for this long. Something's changed. Maybe it's because you inherited the building? Eleanor always said the building chose its own caretakers. You need to show me everything you have on Harold Pemberton, Sarah said. If I'm going to help him, and I can't believe I'm saying that, I need to understand what happened to him. Toby's apartment was exactly what Sarah had expected, a conspiracy theorist's paradise crammed into a space barely larger than her own. Multiple monitors displayed various tracking programs, walls were covered with photographs, charts, and newspaper clippings connected by red string, and every surface was stacked with meticulously organized files. But despite the chaos, there was an underlying method to Toby's madness. Everything was labeled, dated, and cross-referenced with the precision of a professional archivist. I started investigating after my first week here, Toby explained, pulling out a thick binder labeled Pemberton Building Anomalies, Volume 1. The electromagnetic readings were off the charts, especially on the 3rd floor. Your apartment showed the most activity, but back then you just ignored my attempts to discuss it. Sarah remembered those early conversations, Toby's enthusiastic rambling about energy signatures that she'd dismissed as harmless eccentricity. Now she felt guilty for not taking him seriously. Here's what I've pieced together, Toby continued, spreading out a collection of documents on his coffee table. Harold Pemberton, age 34, architect specializing in historical renovations. He was hired in late 1952 to modernize the Pemberton building while preserving its character. The building was owned by his uncle, Marcus Pemberton, who wanted to attract more professional tenants. The documents painted a picture of a meticulous man obsessed with his work. Harold's architectural drawings were incredibly detailed, showing not just structural changes but careful consideration for how each modification would affect the building's residents. His notes revealed someone who understood that a building wasn't just brick and mortar, but a living space that shaped the lives of everyone inside it. He died on March 15, 1953, Toby said, pointing to a yellow death certificate found at his drafting table by his uncle the next morning. Heart attack, brought on by exhaustion and stress. The renovation plans were never completed. Sarah studied a photograph of Harold, the same face she'd seen in her studio, but solid and alive, smiling beside an early version of the building. In the photo, he looked proud and confident, a man who believed in his work and its importance. But here's the interesting part, Toby continued, pulling out a manila folder. I found these in Eleanor's apartment after her death. She left them on her kitchen table with a note saying, "For when Sarah is ready." Inside the folder were more of Harold's architectural drawings, but these were different from the official plans. These sketches showed modifications that seemed impossible, hidden passages between apartments, secret rooms tucked into unused corners, and a complex ventilation system that would allow the building to breathe like a living organism. The drawings were annotated in two different handwritings, Harold's precise architectural notes and Eleanor's flowing script. Eleanor knew about Harold, Sarah said, studying the annotations. She was helping him somehow. More than that, Toby said excitedly. Look at the dates on Eleanor's notes. She's been documenting Harold's appearances for decades, trying to understand what he needed to find peace. She believed he was trapped by his unfinished work. Eleanor's notes were a revelation. She'd written about Harold's nocturnal wanderings, his attempts to continue working on the renovation plans, his confusion about the passage of time. But more importantly, she'd written about her growing understanding that Harold wasn't just a ghost, he was the building's conscience, its memory of what it was meant to become. Harold sees the building's true potential, Sarah read from one of Eleanor's longer entries. He understands that it's not just a place to live, but a community. His plans weren't just about modernization, they were about creating spaces where people could connect, support each other, grow together. That's why he can't rest. The building is incomplete without his vision. And here's the really fascinating part, Toby said, pulling out a blueprint that made Sarah's breath catch. This is Harold's master plan for the third floor. Look familiar? The drawing showed Sarah's studio, but transformed. Where her standing desk sat, Harold had designed a community workspace, a shared area where residents could collaborate on projects, help each other with work, or simply gather to break the isolation of urban living. The space was meant to be the heart of the building, a place where the community could come together. He's been trying to fix my desk because it's not positioned correctly for his vision, Sarah realized. In his plan, that area was meant to accommodate multiple people working together, not one person standing alone. Exactly. And according to Eleanor's notes, the more isolated the building's residents become, the more agitated Harold gets. He feeds off community energy, the connections between people, the sense of belonging. That's why he's been stronger lately. You inheriting the building has started to bring people together again. Sarah thought about her conversations with Rosario, Felix, and Toby himself, the first real connections she'd made with her neighbors in 3 years. Harold had become visible to her just as she was beginning to see the building as more than just a place to sleep and work. Eleanor left you the building because she knew you could complete Harold's work, Toby continued. Not the architectural part, that was never really the point. The community part. The connections. The sense of home that Harold was trying to create. But how am I supposed to do that? I don't know anything about building communities. I've spent 3 years hiding from my neighbors. Toby grinned. And yet here you are, in my apartment, working together to solve a mystery. You've already started. Sarah looked around at Toby's carefully organized research. Thinking about Rosario's protective concern for the building's residents, Felix's artistic documentation of their shared history, and Harold's decades-long dedication to a vision he'd never lived to see completed. For the first time since inheriting the building, she began to understand what Eleanor had seen in her. We need to find Harold's original plans, she said. The complete renovation blueprint. If we're going to help him find peace, we need to understand exactly what he was trying to build. Toby's eyes lit up with renewed purpose. I know exactly where to look. But we're going to need help from someone who's been here even longer. Then Eleanor, someone who might remember when Harold was still alive. Felix, Sarah said. Felix, Toby agreed. And we should probably let Rosario know what's happening. If we're going to transform this building into Harold's vision of community, we'll need everyone on board. As they gathered up the files and photographs, Sarah felt a familiar chill in the air. Harold's presence was returning, drawn perhaps by their discussion of his work. But this time, instead of fear, she felt determination. She had a ghost to help, a building to restore, and a community to build. Eleanor's faith in her was finally beginning to make sense. The next morning brought an unexpected interruption to Sarah's newfound sense of purpose. She was reviewing Harold's blueprints with her coffee when a sharp knock echoed through her studio, not the familiar rhythm of her tenants, but something more aggressive, more businesslike. Through her peephole, she saw a man in an expensive charcoal suit holding a leather portfolio and checking his phone with the impatience of someone accustomed to immediate responses. Everything about him screamed corporate efficiency, from his precisely styled dark hair to his shoes that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "Sarah White," he asked when she opened the door, extending a hand with practiced confidence. "I'm James Pemberton from Pemberton Development Group. I'd like to discuss a business opportunity regarding your recent inheritance." The surname hit Sarah like a physical blow. Pemberton. The same name as Harold, as the building itself. She found herself staring at the man's face, searching for resemblances to the ghost she'd spoken with just days before. "May I come in?" James continued, his smile professional but warm. "I think you'll find my proposal quite generous." Sarah's studio felt smaller with James Pemberton in it. He moved through the space with the assessing eye of someone who saw square footage and profit margins rather than home. His gaze lingered on her standing desk, now positioned at its proper height after her morning battle with the manual controls. "Interesting setup," he commented, settling onto her couch with casual authority. "Remote work has certainly changed how people use their spaces." "What can I do for you, Mr. Pemberton?" Sarah asked, remaining standing despite the awkwardness it created. James opened his portfolio with the smooth efficiency of a practiced presentation. "I represent a development group that specializes in historical property renovation. We've been tracking the Pemberton building for several years, waiting for the right opportunity to restore it to its full potential." He spread out architectural renderings that transformed the building into something unrecognizable, sleek, modern apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows, a rooftop deck, and a ground-floor commercial space that screamed upscale coffee shop. The building's character, its quirky imperfections and worn charm, had been erased in favor of generic luxury. "We're prepared to offer you $8 million for the property," James continued. "Cash, closing within 30 days. You'd be free to relocate anywhere you'd like, perhaps invest in your graphic design business." Sarah's mouth went dry. $8 million. Enough to pay off her student loans, buy her own place, never worry about rent again. Enough to transform her precarious freelance existence into actual financial security. The current tenants would be relocated, of course, James added casually. "We provide reasonable notice and assistance with moving expenses." "Relocated?" Sarah's voice came out sharper than she intended. "You mean evicted?" "It's standard procedure for this type of renovation. The building requires extensive modernization that can't be done with occupied units." James's tone remained pleasant, but something in his eyes suggested he wasn't accustomed to pushback. "We're not talking about displacement, we're talking about an opportunity for everyone to upgrade their living situations." Sarah thought about Rosario, who'd found safety in this building after fleeing an abusive relationship. About Toby, whose disability payments probably couldn't cover market-rate rent anywhere else in Portland. About Felix and his decades of murals documenting the building's history. About Dr. Okafor, stretching her professor's salary to pay off student loans. "These people aren't just tenants," she said. "They're a community." James's expression shifted slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine confusion. "Communities can be rebuilt anywhere. But opportunities like this, for both you and the building, don't come along often." A familiar chill began to creep through the studio, and Sarah noticed her breath starting to mist slightly. Harold's presence was stirring, responding perhaps to the threat James represented. "The building has good bones," James continued, apparently oblivious to the temperature drop. "Strong foundation, solid construction. It just needs someone with vision to unlock its potential." "What's your connection to this building?" Sarah asked, remembering the name from Harold's architectural drawings. Pemberton isn't exactly a common surname. For the first time, James's professional composure cracked slightly. "It's a family connection. My great-uncle owned this building back in the 1950s. There's some unfinished family business here. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees, and Sarah watched James unconsciously pull his suit jacket tighter around himself. Behind him, she could see Harold beginning to materialize, his translucent form growing more solid as his agitation increased. Your great-uncle, Sarah said carefully. Would that be Marcus Pemberton? You know the family history? James looked surprised and pleased. Yes, Marcus Pemberton. He had grand plans for modernizing this place, bringing it up to contemporary standards. Unfortunately, he died before those plans could be completed. Harold's form solidified further, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching recognition. He stepped closer to James, studying his profile with intense curiosity. Marcus had a nephew, Sarah said, watching Harold's reaction. An architect named Harold who was working on renovation plans. James's expression darkened. Harold Pemberton was a cautionary tale in our family. Brilliant man, but he lost himself in his work. Died young from the stress of trying to perfect impossible plans. My grandfather always said Harold was too idealistic for practical business. Harold's ghostly form flickered with anger, and the temperature in the studio dropped to nearly freezing. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs as she watched the spirit of a man react to his family's dismissal of his life's work. What if I told you Harold's plans weren't impossible? Sarah asked. What if they were just misunderstood? I'd say you've been listening to too many romantic stories about the past. James stood, gathering his materials with renewed efficiency. The reality is that buildings are investments, not monuments to dead architects' dreams. This offer won't stay open indefinitely, Miss White. Market conditions change, opportunities disappear. As James moved toward the door, Harold stepped directly into his path. For a moment, the living man paused, his expression shifting to puzzlement as he unconsciously shivered. His eyes seemed to look right through Harold, but some family connection or inherited sensitivity, made him hesitate. You look familiar, James said to Sarah, though his gaze seemed fixed on the space where Harold stood. Have we met before? I don't think so, Sarah replied, watching Harold reach out as if to touch his great-nephew's face. James shook his head, clearing whatever spell had momentarily held him. Think about my offer, he said, his professional mask sliding back into place. $8 million, cash. But don't think too long, there are other developers interested in this area. After James left, Harold's form remained solid, his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been grief. He looks like Marcus, Harold said finally. But younger. How is that possible? That's your great-nephew, Sarah explained gently. Marcus's grandson. James. Great-nephew? Harold's form flickered as he processed the implications. But that would mean, how long have I been? 72 years, Sarah reminded him. James never knew you. Your family thinks your work was a failure. Harold's expression crumpled, and the temperature in the studio began to return to normal as his emotional turmoil shifted from anger to sadness. They forgot about me. About the plans. About what this building was supposed to become. Sarah looked at the architectural renderings James had left behind, his vision of sterile luxury versus Harold's dream of community connection. The choice between financial security and preserving something irreplaceable had never felt more stark. They didn't forget, she said firmly. They just never understood. But we're going to change that. Harold looked at her with something like hope beginning to kindle in his translucent eyes. We? You, me, Toby, everyone in this building who believes in what you were trying to create. Sarah gathered up James's papers, her decision crystallizing. We're going to complete your work, Harold. And we're going to show your family what they've been missing. Outside her windows, the building seemed to exhale with relief, as if it too had been holding its breath waiting for her choice. Sarah had just turned down financial security for a chance to build something more valuable, a home that honored both past and present. The real work was just beginning. Sarah needed answers that went beyond Toby's enthusiastic theories and Harold's confused memories. If she was going to help a 70-year-old ghost find peace while preserving a community, she needed to understand the science behind what was happening in her building. That meant talking to someone who could approach the supernatural with rational methodology. Dr. Amara Okafor answered her apartment door on the 4th floor with the cautious politeness of someone accustomed to interruptions from undergraduates seeking deadline extensions. She was younger than Sarah had expected, probably early 30s, with natural hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of precise wire-rimmed glasses that suggested serious academic work. You're the new landlord, Dr. Okafor said, her Nigerian accent lending a melodic quality to her careful words. I was wondering when you'd introduce yourself properly. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm still figuring out what I'm supposed to be doing. Sarah shifted nervously, acutely aware that she was about to sound completely insane. I was hoping you might be able to help me with something. It's unconventional. Dr. Okafor's apartment was a study in organized efficiency, books stacked in precise piles, a desk covered with research papers and equations, and what looked like several pieces of specialized electronic equipment humming quietly in the corner. The space felt more like a laboratory than a home. Quantum physics, Dr. Okafor explained, following Sarah's gaze to the equipment. I'm researching quantum field fluctuations and their interaction with environmental electromagnetic patterns. It's dry work, but it pays the bills. Actually, that might be exactly what I need to understand. Sarah took a deep breath. Dr. Okafor, do you believe in ghosts? The physicist's expression didn't change, but something sharpened in her dark eyes. That's an interesting question. From a scientific perspective, the concept of persistent human consciousness after death would require mechanisms that contradict our current understanding of neurobiology and physics. However, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I've observed some anomalous readings in this building that warrant investigation. What kind of readings? Dr. Okafor moved to her equipment, pulling up data on a tablet. Electromagnetic field fluctuations that don't correspond to any known electrical sources. Temperature variations that occur in isolated pockets without any apparent thermodynamic cause. And most intriguingly, quantum field perturbations that seem to follow patterns rather than random distribution. Sarah felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone who could discuss Harold's presence without immediately jumping to supernatural explanations or dismissing the phenomenon entirely. These anomalies, Sarah said carefully, do they happen more frequently in certain areas of the building? The third floor shows the highest activity, particularly in the early morning hours. But there's something else. Dr. Okafor pulled up another screen showing wave patterns that looked like complex heartbeats. The patterns suggest intentionality. These aren't random quantum fluctuations, they're organized, purposeful. As if something is attempting to interact with our physical reality in very specific ways. What if I told you I've seen the source of those patterns? Dr. Okafor set down her tablet and studied Sarah with the focused attention of a scientist presented with new data. I'd say I'd like to examine your evidence. So Sarah told her everything. Harold's appearances, his confusion about time and technology, his obsession with fixing her standing desk, his connection to the building's architectural history. Dr. Okafor listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on her tablet. Show me, Dr. Okafor said when Sarah finished. They went down to Sarah's studio, where Dr. Okafor began setting up portable monitoring equipment with the methodical precision of someone conducting a formal experiment. She placed electromagnetic sensors around the room, positioned temperature monitors at strategic points, and activated what she called a quantum field detector near Sarah's desk. If your Harold appears on schedule, Dr. Okafor explained, we should be able to document the exact nature of his manifestation. More importantly, we might understand how he's able to interact with physical objects. They didn't have to wait long. As the evening deepened toward Harold's usual appearance time, the equipment began registering changes. Temperature sensors showed the familiar precipitous drop, electromagnetic readings spiked in complex patterns, and the quantum field detector produced readings that made Dr. Okafor's eyebrows rise. Fascinating, she murmured, watching the data stream across her tablet. The quantum field is being manipulated in ways that should be impossible. It's as if consciousness itself is creating localized reality distortions. Harold materialized. Gradually, becoming solid enough to cast shadows in the lamplight. Dr. Okafor watched his appearance with the detached fascination of a researcher observing a particularly interesting specimen. Good evening, Harold, Sarah said. I'd like you to meet Dr. Okafor. She's a scientist. Harold adjusted his glasses and nodded politely toward Dr. Okafor, though his expression suggested he couldn't quite see her clearly. A scientist? What field? Physics? Engineering? Quantum physics, Dr. Okafor replied, apparently unfazed by conversing with a translucent figure from the 1950s. I study the fundamental nature of reality. Quantum physics? Harold looked puzzled. I'm not familiar with that term. Is it related to atomic theory? You could say that, Dr. Okafor said diplomatically. Harold, when you adjust Sarah's desk, how do you interact with the physical mechanism? Harold demonstrated, his ghostly hands somehow gaining enough solidity to manipulate the manual controls. Dr. Okafor's equipment registered massive spikes in electromagnetic activity as Harold worked. Extraordinary, Dr. Okafor murmured. You're temporarily altering the quantum state of matter at the point of contact. The energy required for such manipulation should be enormous, but you're doing it effortlessly. I don't understand, Harold said, stepping back from the desk. I'm simply adjusting the height to proper ergonomic standards. The how is as important as the why, Dr. Okafor explained to Sarah. Harold's consciousness is somehow interfacing directly with quantum fields, allowing him to influence physical reality. But this level of interaction requires tremendous energy, which explains why his manifestations are strongest in areas where he has emotional connections. The building, Sarah realized. He's drawing energy from his connection to this place. Precisely. His unfinished work here created an emotional resonance that transcends normal consciousness. He's literally bound to this building by quantum entanglement with his own unfulfilled intentions. Harold listened to their explanation with growing confusion and distress. I don't understand any of this. I'm just trying to complete my renovation plans. The building needs improvements, and I can't rest until the work is finished. Dr. Okafor exchanged glances with Sarah. From a purely scientific perspective, Harold's continued existence violates several fundamental laws of physics. However, quantum consciousness theory suggests that sufficiently strong emotional or purposeful connections might create persistent information patterns that could maintain coherent existence beyond biological death. In English, please, Sarah said. Harold's dedication to his work was so complete that it created a quantum impression, a consciousness pattern that remained bound to this building. He's not technically alive, but he's not gone either. He exists. In a state of quantum superposition, neither fully present nor absent. Can we help him move on? Sarah asked. Theoretically, yes. If we can help him complete his unfinished business, truly complete it, not just abandon it, the quantum entanglement should resolve naturally. His consciousness would finally be free to transition to whatever comes next. Harold had been listening intently, his expression cycling through confusion, hope, and determination. You're saying if I finish the renovation plans, I can rest? More than that, Dr. Okafor said gently. If you can see your vision truly completed, not just the plans, but the actual building transformation you dreamed of, then yes. You should find peace. Sarah looked around her studio, thinking about Harold's blueprints for community spaces, about James's sterile luxury development plans, about her own growing connection to the building's residents. The scientific explanation didn't make the task any easier, but it did make Harold's situation feel less impossible and more like a problem with a solution. Then that's what we'll do, she said firmly. We'll complete your work, Harold. All of it. Dr. Okafor began packing up her equipment. I'd like to continue monitoring the quantum field fluctuations throughout this process. From a research perspective, this could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and reality. And from a human perspective? Sarah asked. Dr. Okafor smiled, the first truly warm expression Sarah had seen from her. From a human perspective, I think you're doing something beautiful. This building deserves to become what Harold envisioned it could be. As Harold's form began to fade with the approaching dawn, he looked more hopeful than Sarah had ever seen him. Science had given him something he'd lacked for 70 years, a clear path forward. Now they just had to walk it. The next morning found Sarah staring at Harold's incomplete blueprints spread across her desk, trying to understand what a 1950s architect had envisioned for a building that needed to serve a 21st century community. Dr. Okafor's scientific explanation had given her hope, but it had also clarified the magnitude of the challenge. Harold needed to see his vision truly completed, not just abandoned or compromised. But Harold's official architectural plans, detailed as they were, felt incomplete. They showed structural improvements, updated utilities, and modernized spaces, but they didn't capture the soul of what he'd been trying to create. There were hints of something deeper in his sketches: community spaces, gathering areas, design. Elements that seemed to encourage interaction, but the full vision remained elusive. Felix Martinez held the missing pieces. Sarah found him in the third-floor hallway, adding delicate touches to the section of his mural that depicted the building's 1950s era. His weathered hands moved with the steady precision of someone who'd spent decades perfecting his craft, each brushstroke deliberate and meaningful. You're troubled, Felix said without looking up from his work. The weight of inheritance is heavier than you expected. Felix, I need to understand what Harold was really trying to build. His blueprints show the technical details, but they don't show the heart of his vision. Eleanor's notes suggest you knew more about this building's history than anyone. Felix stepped back from his mural, studying the 1950s section with the critical eye of an artist evaluating his own work. Come, he said simply. It's time you saw the whole story. Felix's apartment was a revelation. Where the hallway murals were beautiful, his private workspace was extraordinary. Every wall was covered with detailed paintings that chronicled not just the building's physical changes, but the lives of the people who'd inhabited it across decades. Sarah could see Eleanor as a young woman, fierce and determined, arguing with city officials about building codes. She saw Rosario arriving with a single suitcase and a black eye, finding sanctuary in a space that asked no questions. She saw Toby in better days, before whatever breakdown had brought him here, brilliant and confident in a tech company conference room. The building has always been a haven, Felix explained, leading her to a section of wall she hadn't noticed. From the doorway, Eleanor understood that, but she wasn't the first. The painting Felix showed her took Sarah's breath away. It depicted Harold's office, her current studio, but not as she'd ever seen it. The space was alive with activity, Harold at his drafting table, surrounded by other architects and engineers, but also by tenants. A young mother bounced a baby while pointing to design elements that would affect her family. An elderly man in a wheelchair examined accessibility modifications. A group of artists discussed how natural light could be optimized for their work. Harold didn't just design buildings, Felix said softly. He designed communities. His renovation plans weren't imposed from above, they were collaborative creations, involving everyone who lived here. But how do you know all this? The level of detail in your paintings? Felix's expression grew thoughtful, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked his full age. Because I was here, Mija. I was young, just arrived from Los Angeles, trying to make it as an artist. Harold hired me to document the renovation process, to capture the human side of architectural change. Sarah stared at him in shock. You knew Harold personally? I was his apprentice, in a way. Not in architecture, but in understanding how spaces shape communities. Felix moved to another section of wall, showing Sarah a painting of Harold working late into the night, but this time she could see the full context. His office wasn't isolated, hidden passages connected it to other parts of the building, allowing him to observe how residents actually used their spaces, how they moved through the building, where they gathered naturally. The hidden passages, Sarah said. Toby mentioned them, but I thought they were just old service corridors. Harold designed them as observation routes. He wanted to understand how people really lived before he changed their homes. But they became something more, ways for residents to help each other without disrupting privacy. A mother could slip meals to a struggling neighbor through a hidden panel. An elderly tenant could get help without admitting vulnerability. Felix led her to a cabinet filled with carefully preserved sketches and notes. Harold left these with me the night before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure his real vision wasn't lost. The sketches revealed Harold's true genius. His plans weren't just about modernizing the building, they were about creating a physical infrastructure for community care. Sarah saw designs for communal workspaces that could be reconfigured for different needs, gathering areas positioned to encourage natural interaction, and storage systems that allowed neighbors to share resources easily. Your standing desk problem, Felix said with a gentle smile, was Harold trying to tell you something? In his original plan, that space wasn't meant for one person working alone. It was designed as a collaborative area where residents could work together, share skills, support each other's projects. But why didn't he complete these plans? Why did he die with them unfinished? Felix's expression darkened. Marcus Pemberton got impatient. He wanted the renovations finished quickly so he could raise rents and attract wealthier tenants. Harold refused to compromise his vision, insisted on maintaining the community involvement process. They fought the night Harold died. Sarah studied a particularly detailed sketch showing her studio transformed into a vibrant community workspace. She could see Harold's vision, flexible work areas that could accommodate everything from sewing circles to computer programming, storage for shared tools and resources, and sight lines that maintained privacy while encouraging interaction. Eleanor knew about these plans? Eleanor was Harold's strongest advocate among the residents. When he died, she made Marcus promise to preserve the building as affordable housing. She spent the next 50 years slowly implementing Harold's community vision, piece by piece, without the formal renovations. Felix showed Sarah another section of his mural, one depicting Eleanor's decades of quiet leadership. Sarah could see her organizing tenant meetings, facilitating shared gardens, creating informal networks of mutual support. Eleanor had been building Harold's vision without blueprints, using relationships instead of architecture. That's why she left you the building, Felix continued. She saw that you had the skills Harold's vision needed, not just to manage property, but to bring people together. Your graphic design background, your understanding of visual communication, your ability to translate complex ideas into accessible forms. Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. She wanted me to complete Harold's work, but not just the architectural renovation. The community building. Exactly. But there's something else you need to understand. Felix pulled out a final sketch, this one showing the building's exterior transformed with murals that told the story of every resident who'd ever lived there. Harold's vision wasn't just about this building. He saw it as a model that could be replicated, a way to create affordable housing that actually built communities instead of just warehousing people. James, Sarah said suddenly. Harold's great-nephew. He's a developer. If we could show him what Harold was really trying to create. You might save more than just this building, Felix finished. You might change how he approaches all his developments. Sarah looked around at Felix's documentation of 70 years of community life, at Harold's carefully preserved vision of architectural collaboration, at the evidence of Eleanor's quiet legacy of bringing people together. The weight of inheritance felt different now, not just responsibility, but opportunity. Will you help me? She asked Felix. Will you help me show Harold's family what he was really trying to build? Felix smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Mija, I've been waiting 70 years for someone to ask that question. Of course I'll help. Outside, Sarah could hear the building settling into its evening rhythms, Rosario cooking dinner, Toby typing at his computer, Dr. Okafor running equations, all the small sounds of people making home together. Harold's vision was already partially realized, built through decades of Eleanor's patient community building. Now they just needed to make it visible, permanent, and complete. They needed to show Harold that his dream hadn't died with him, it had been growing quietly for 70 years, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Now they just needed to make it visible, permanent, and complete. They needed to show Harold that his dream hadn't died with him, it had been growing quietly for 70 years, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Sarah had been rehearsing this conversation for 3 days, but standing outside James Pemberton's downtown office building, she felt wholly unprepared. How do you tell someone that their dead great-uncle has been haunting a building for 70 years? How do you convince a corporate developer that community-centered architecture matters more than profit margins? The answer, she decided, was to let Harold tell his own story. James's office reflected his professional success, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Portland skyline, sleek furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars, and architectural models of gleaming development projects arranged like trophies. He looked surprised but pleased when his assistant ushered Sarah into the space. Sarah, this is unexpected. Have you reconsidered my offer? Actually, I wanted to show you something about your family history. About Harold. Sarah set down the portfolio case she'd borrowed from Felix, her heart racing. I think there are things about your great-uncle that your family never understood. James's expression grew cautious. I told you, Harold was brilliant but impractical. His obsession with impossible perfection killed him. What if I told you his work wasn't impossible? What if I told you he was decades ahead of his time, designing buildings that created communities instead of just housing people? Sarah spread out Felix's paintings on James's conference table, the vibrant depictions of Harold's collaborative design process, the images of tenants working together to shape their own living spaces, the documentation of 70 years of community life growing from Harold's foundational vision. These are beautiful, James said diplomatically, but I'm not sure what you're trying to show me. Your great-uncle wasn't just an architect. He was a social innovator. Look at this. Sarah pulled out Harold's original sketches, the ones Felix had preserved. He was designing co-housing concepts in 1953, creating accessibility features. Decades before ADA requirements, planning flexible spaces that could adapt to changing community needs. James studied the drawings more carefully, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine attention. These are remarkably forward-thinking. But why are you showing me this? Sarah took a deep breath. Because Harold never left the building. He's been there for 70 years, trying to complete his work. I'm sorry, what? Your great-uncle is haunting the Pemberton building. I've spoken with him. He's been adjusting my standing desk every night because in his original plans, that space was designed as a community workspace. James stared at her as if she'd started speaking in tongues. Sarah, I think the stress of property ownership might be affecting you. Perhaps you should consider, I can prove it, Sarah interrupted. Come with me to the building tonight. Let me show you what your family dismissed as impossible. The skepticism in James's eyes warred with something else, curiosity, perhaps, or a developer's instinct for unexplored opportunities. Even if I believed you, which I don't, what would be the point? The point is that Harold's vision could revolutionize affordable housing development. Imagine buildings that create communities, that support residents instead of just warehousing them. Imagine the marketing potential alone, developments that actually improve people's lives. Something in James's expression shifted. Sarah had found his language, business opportunity. That evening, James arrived at the Pemberton building wearing jeans and a look of bemused skepticism. Dr. Okafor had set up her monitoring equipment in Sarah's studio, while Toby and Felix waited in the hallway, ready to provide additional testimony, if needed. "I can't believe I'm here," James muttered, studying the electromagnetic sensors with the expression of someone questioning his own sanity. "The readings are already beginning to fluctuate," Dr. Okafor reported, her scientific calm helping to ground the surreal situation. "Temperature is dropping, electromagnetic activity is increasing." Harold materialized gradually, becoming solid enough to cast shadows in the lamplight. James went rigid, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and something approaching terror. That's impossible," he whispered. Harold looked confused, studying James with the same intensity James was studying him. "You look familiar," Harold said slowly. "You have Marcus's eyes, but you're too young. Who are you?" "I'm James Pemberton," James managed, his voice barely audible. "Marcus was my great-grandfather." You're Harold?" "Your family," Harold said with wonder, his form becoming more solid as his excitement grew. "Marcus's grandson? But how? When?" "Great-grandson," James corrected automatically. "Marcus died in 1978. It's 2025, Harold." The weight of lost time settled over Harold's ghostly features. 72 years, he said softly. "I've been working on these plans for 72 years. "Your plans," James said, finding his voice. "The renovation designs. The family always said they were too idealistic, too expensive to implement." "Too expensive?" Harold's form flickered with indignation. "Creating communities is too expensive? Building spaces where people can support each other, share resources, thrive together, that's too expensive?" "That's not how development works," James said defensively. "You have to consider profit margins, market demands, return on investment." "Market demands," Harold repeated bitterly. "Do you know what the market demands, James? It demands places where people can afford to live with dignity. It demands buildings that strengthen communities instead of isolating individuals. It demands spaces that help people become their best selves." Felix stepped forward from where he'd been watching in the doorway. "Harold, show him the plans. The real plans." Harold nodded, moving to Sarah's desk with purposeful determination. As his ghostly hands touched the surface, the standing desk began to transform. It lowered to the proper height, but more than that, the space around it seemed to shift, showing James what the studio could become. "Flexible workstations," Harold explained, his enthusiasm overriding his confusion about time. "Residents can collaborate on projects, share skills, build businesses together. The mother in 2A teaches sewing, the programmer in 4B offers computer classes, the artist in 3B," he gestured toward Felix, "documents the community's growth." James watched the ghostly demonstration with growing fascination. "You're talking about co-working spaces, community kitchens, shared resources. These are cutting-edge concepts in modern development." "They were cutting-edge concepts in 1953 too," Harold said proudly. "I wasn't designing buildings, James. I was designing a way of life." "But the financial model works beautifully," Sarah interrupted, showing James Eleanor's records. "Below market rents, but lower turnover costs, reduced maintenance expenses because residents take care of their community, and long-term tenant stability that creates predictable income streams." Dr. Okafor added her voice to the conversation. From a social science perspective, Harold's designs address isolation, mental health, and community resilience, issues that cost society billions in healthcare and social services. James looked around the room at Harold's ghostly presence, Felix's artistic documentation, Dr. Okafor's scientific validation, and Sarah's passionate advocacy. "You're serious about this? All of you? Your great-uncle spent 70 years trying to complete work that could change how we think about housing," Toby said from the doorway. "The question is, are you willing to help him finish it?" Harold's form began to solidify further as James's skepticism gave way to genuine engagement. "James," Harold said urgently, "you have the resources I never had. You understand the business side I struggled with. Together, we could build communities, not just buildings." James was quiet for a long moment, studying Harold's translucent face, a face that carried the same determined expression James saw in his own mirror each morning. "What would you need from me?" "Partnership," Harold said simply. "Help me complete the Pemberton building renovation, and then help me share this model with other developers. Show the world that profitable development and community building aren't mutually exclusive." Sarah watched as decades of family misunderstanding began to dissolve. Harold had finally found someone who could speak both his language of social vision and the language of practical implementation. One condition, James said. I want to document everything. If we're going to prove this model works, we need data. Measurable outcomes, replicable processes. Harold's ghostly form practically glowed with excitement. Yes. Exactly. That's what I've been missing, the bridge between idealism and implementation. As the two Pembertons began discussing architectural details and business models, Sarah felt a profound shift in the building's atmosphere. Harold's 70-year isolation was ending. His family connection was being restored. His vision was finally finding the support it needed to become reality. The real work was just beginning. 3 months into the renovation, the Pemberton building had become a construction site that somehow still felt like home. James had brought in contractors who understood Harold's vision, workers who approached the project not as a simple modernization, but as the completion of a 70-year-old dream. Every morning, Sarah watched through her windows as the building slowly transformed into something that honored both its past and its future. Harold's presence had become stronger during the renovation, no longer confined to nighttime appearances. He moved through the building like a consultant, examining every detail, offering suggestions that James's architects initially dismissed until they realized the ghost's recommendations consistently improved both function and community flow. Dr. Okafor had documented the phenomenon extensively, her quantum field readings showing that Harold's consciousness was becoming more stable as his vision approached reality. It's unprecedented, she explained to Sarah one afternoon, reviewing her latest data. Usually, unresolved spiritual manifestations become weaker over time as their connection to the physical world fades. But Harold is becoming more present, more coherent. Completing his work is literally giving him more life. The transformation wasn't just physical. Sarah had watched her neighbors evolve from polite strangers into genuine community members. Rosario had started an informal dinner club, rotating between apartments and bringing together residents who might never have spoken otherwise. Toby's expertise in building systems had made him invaluable to the renovation process, and his confidence had grown with each problem he solved. Felix documented every change with new murals, creating a visual timeline of the building's rebirth. Sarah's studio bore the most dramatic changes. The space had been expanded by incorporating the adjacent storage room, creating exactly the community workspace Harold had envisioned in 1953. Her standing desk remained, but it was now part of a larger configuration of flexible workstations, shared resources, and collaboration areas. The morning she'd spent years working alone had been replaced by a vibrant hub where neighbors came to work on projects, share skills, and simply connect. The measurements are perfect, Harold said one evening, materializing beside the renovated workspace with obvious satisfaction. The sight lines, the natural light flow, the acoustic considerations, everything encourages interaction while maintaining privacy options. James had become a regular evening visitor, fascinated by his conversations with Harold and increasingly committed to understanding his great-uncle's revolutionary approach to community development. Their discussions ranged from technical architectural details to broader questions about the social responsibility of developers. I've been thinking about what you said, James told Harold during one of these sessions. About buildings creating communities instead of just housing people. My other projects, they're profitable, but they're not meaningful. Harold's translucent form seemed to solidify with emotion. Meaningful architecture isn't just about beauty or efficiency, James. It's about creating spaces that help people become their best selves, that foster the connections that make life worth living. But how do you quantify that? How do you convince investors that community value translates to financial return? Sarah pulled out the detailed records she'd been keeping throughout the renovation process. Look at the numbers, she said, spreading spreadsheets across the workspace. 0 tenant turnover during construction, unheard of in renovation projects. Voluntary resident participation in maintenance and improvements, saving thousands in labor costs. Applications to move into the building have increased 400% even though we haven't raised rents. Dr. Okafor added her research to the evidence. The health and wellness metrics are remarkable. Reduced healthcare costs, decreased reported anxiety and depression, increased sense of purpose and belonging among residents. Harold's community design is literally improving people's lives in measurable ways. James studied the data with the intense focus of someone seeing a new paradigm emerge. This could work on a larger scale. If we can replicate this model. That was always the plan, Harold said quietly. This building was meant to be a prototype, a demonstration that affordable housing could build communities instead of warehousing people. The renovation reached its completion on a crisp October morning exactly 73 years after Harold's death. Sarah stood in the transformed community workspace, watching as neighbors gathered for the building's official reopening celebration. The space buzzed with exactly the energy Harold had envisioned. Rosario was teaching a cooking class in the shared kitchen area, Dr. Okafor was helping neighborhood kids with science experiments, Felix was painting portraits while sharing stories about the building's history, and Toby was demonstrating some of the building's more innovative technological features. Harold materialized in the center of the space, more solid and present than Sarah had ever seen him. For the first time, other residents began to notice his presence, not clearly, but as a sense of warmth, of completion, of rightness. "It's beautiful," Harold said, his voice filled with wonder as he looked around at the realization of his decades-old dream. "It's exactly what I hoped for, but more. The technology, the connections, the way people are using the space, it's evolved beyond my original vision." James stood beside his great-uncle, seeing him clearly now that the family connection had been restored. "What happens now? Do you stay?" Harold's form began to shimmer, becoming translucent around the edges. "My work here is complete," he said peacefully. "The building knows how to be a community now. The residents understand their role in maintaining and growing that community. And you," he looked at James with profound gratitude. "You'll carry this vision forward to other places, other buildings, other communities that need what we've created here." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks as she watched Harold begin to fade. "Will we see you again?" "You'll feel me," Harold said, his voice becoming distant but warm. "In every shared meal, every collaborative project, every moment when neighbors become family. This building holds that energy now. It's alive with community spirit." As Harold's presence dissolved into the morning light, Sarah felt the building itself seem to exhale with satisfaction. The Pemberton building had finally become what it was always meant to be, not just a place to live, but a place to thrive together. The standing desk sat at its proper height, surrounded by the evidence of Harold's completed vision. The impossible dream had become beautifully, practically real. 1 year after Harold's peaceful departure, Sarah stood in what was now officially called the Harold Pemberton Community Innovation Center, watching the space buzz with activity that would have made the architect's spirit soar. The morning light streamed through windows that had been carefully positioned to illuminate multiple workstations, where Dr. Okafor was leading a coding workshop for neighborhood teenagers while Felix painted their portraits, capturing the concentration and joy on their young faces. The scene before her represented everything Harold had envisioned and more. 12-year-old Maya Rodriguez sat cross-legged on one of the ergonomic floor cushions, her laptop balanced on her knees as she debugged her first Python program under Dr. Okafor's patient guidance. Her grandmother, Mrs. Chen from apartment 1B, worked at the traditional height desk nearby, teaching origami to a mixed-age group that included both children and adults from the surrounding neighborhood. The intergenerational exchange had become one of the center's most beloved features, wisdom flowing in both directions as digital natives shared technological skills while elders offered life experience and traditional crafts. The beautiful thing, Dr. Okafor had observed during one of her research interviews, is that Harold's design naturally creates these learning communities. The sight lines, the flexible furniture arrangements, the acoustic zones, everything encourages people to share knowledge rather than hoard it. Sarah's standing desk occupied its destined position in the heart of the space, exactly where Harold had insisted it belonged. But it was no longer a source of frustration or solitary work. The adjustable surface had been joined by a constellation of other workstations, traditional seated desks, standing height tables, comfortable reading nooks, and collaborative areas. With whiteboards and projection capabilities, the space could transform throughout the day to accommodate different needs: morning quiet work time, afternoon collaborative sessions, evening community meetings, and weekend workshops. The transformation extended far beyond the physical space. Rosario had launched Pemberton Provisions, a small catering business that operated from the building's shared commercial kitchen, employing 3 other residents and serving the growing community of socially conscious businesses in the neighborhood. Her success story had been featured in Portland Business Journal as an example of how affordable housing could actually incubate entrepreneurship rather than merely provide shelter. "Before the renovation, I was just trying to survive," Rosario had told the reporter, her hands busy preparing her signature plantain empanadas for a corporate lunch order. "I was working 3 part-time jobs just to make rent, with no time or energy to dream bigger. Now I have a business, employees, and a community that supports my success because they know my success strengthens all of us." The shared commercial kitchen had become a model for other affordable housing developments. Unlike typical community kitchens that were rarely used, Harold's design integrated the space seamlessly with both the residential areas and the community. workspace, making it natural for residents to cook together, share meals, and even launch food-based businesses. The health department had initially balked at the mixed-use concept, but the building's zero health violations and thriving food enterprises had convinced them to develop new zoning categories specifically for community-integrated commercial spaces. Rosario's business had inspired other resident entrepreneurs. Toby's evolution from conspiracy theorist to legitimate paranormal consultant had been perhaps the most dramatic transformation in the building. His Portland Paranormal Consulting now employed 2 part-time researchers and had contracts with 3 other property management companies to investigate unexplained phenomena in their buildings. More importantly, his work had revealed that many haunted properties were actually suffering from community dysfunction, isolation, mistrust, and disconnection that created the psychological conditions for supernatural experiences. What I learned from Harold, Toby explained during a presentation to the Portland Landlords Association, is that most ghostly encounters are really expressions of unmet community needs. Buildings develop spiritual problems when they fail to nurture human connection, fix the community dynamics, and the paranormal activity typically resolves itself. His research had attracted attention from urban sociologists, who were discovering correlations between reported supernatural activity and social isolation metrics. Toby's systematic approach to documenting and addressing these phenomena had led to consulting contracts in Seattle, San Francisco, and even New York, where his reputation for solving unsolvable property problems was growing. Dr. Okafor's quantum consciousness research had yielded discoveries that were reshaping both physics and architecture. Her papers on environmental consciousness entanglement were being cited by researchers worldwide, suggesting that Harold's 70-year presence might have been an extreme example of a phenomenon that was actually quite common, the way human intentions and emotions became embedded in the spaces they inhabited. We're discovering that consciousness and place interact in ways we're only beginning to understand, she'd explained during her recent TED Talk, which had garnered over 2 million views. Harold Pemberton's connection to his building may have been an extraordinary example of something that happens in subtle ways everywhere, the way our deepest intentions and strongest emotions create lasting impressions in the environments we care about. Her research had practical applications far beyond ghost stories. Understanding how human consciousness interacted with physical environments was leading to breakthroughs in therapeutic architecture, workspace design, and community planning. Hospitals were redesigning patient rooms based on her findings about how emotional energy affected healing outcomes. Tech companies were incorporating her research into office designs that improved both productivity and employee well-being. Urban planners were consulting her work to understand how neighborhood design affected mental health and social cohesion. The Pemberton building had become an unlikely laboratory for studying these interactions. Dr. Okafor's quantum field monitoring equipment remained permanently installed throughout the building, documenting how community activities affected the measurable energy patterns in different spaces. Her data showed that collaborative activities created distinctly different quantum signatures than isolated individual work, and that these patterns seemed to reinforce themselves over time. Spaces used for collaboration became increasingly conducive to collaboration, while isolated spaces became more isolating. It's as if the building learns, she'd written in her latest paper for the Journal of Consciousness Studies. The quantum field patterns suggest that environments develop preferences based on how they're used, creating feedback loops that either enhance or diminish human connection. Felix had documented every stage of the building's transformation through his expanding mural project, which now covered not just the hallways but also selected walls in the community spaces. His visual timeline had become a pilgrimage site for artists, urban planners, and community organizers who wanted to understand how spaces could evolve to support human flourishing. The murals told stories within stories. The section depicting Harold's original 1950s vision was now accompanied by images of its 2025 realization, the same spaces shown in both eras, revealing how Harold's social insights had been decades ahead of their time. Felix had painted Dr. Okafor's coding workshops alongside 1950s images of Harold teaching neighborhood children basic engineering principles. Rosario's cooking classes appeared next to historical scenes of community potluck dinners. The visual parallels made it clear that Harold's vision hadn't been about specific technologies or contemporary trends, it had been about timeless human needs for learning, sharing, and belonging. What Felix has captured, said Dr. Miranda Santos, a cultural anthropologist from Portland State University who was documenting the building as part of a larger study on intentional communities, is the continuity of human social needs across different technological and cultural contexts. The murals show that successful communities require the same basic elements regardless of whether they're happening in 1953 or 2025: spaces that encourage interaction, systems that facilitate sharing, and designs that assume the best of human nature. Felix's work had been featured in galleries and museums, but he'd consistently turned down offers to relocate or create installations elsewhere. His art belonged where it had grown, where the stories it told continued to unfold daily in the lives of the people who called the building home. "This building is my canvas," he'd explained to a curator from the Smithsonian who had offered him a solo exhibition in Washington, D.C. "These stories belong here, with the people who lived them. Moving them would break the connection between art and life that makes them meaningful." His commitment to place had inspired other community-based artists, leading to what urban planners were calling the Felix effect, artists choosing to embed their work permanently in the communities that inspired it, creating cultural anchors that strengthen neighborhood identity and pride. James had perhaps experienced the most profound transformation of anyone connected to the building. His development company, now renamed Pemberton Community Development, had abandoned luxury condos entirely in favor of affordable housing projects that prioritized community building over profit maximization. The business model had initially terrified his investors, but the results were undeniable. Waiting lists for Pemberton properties averaged over 200 people, tenant satisfaction scores exceeded 95%, and maintenance costs were 40% below industry averages due to residents' investment in caring for their shared spaces. Traditional development assumes that people want to be left alone, that privacy equals happiness, James explained during a keynote address at the National Affordable Housing Conference. "Harold taught me that people actually crave connection, but they need spaces designed to make connection easy and natural. When you give people infrastructure for community, they create communities. When you give them infrastructure for isolation, they become isolated." The Pemberton model was being replicated across the country. 3 new developments in Portland were under construction using Harold's principles, with adaptations for different populations and neighborhood contexts. Seattle had approved 5 Pemberton-inspired projects. San Francisco, Austin, Denver, and Minneapolis had all hired James as a consultant for affordable housing initiatives that prioritized community building. The model's financial sustainability had convinced skeptics who might have dismissed it as idealistic social work. By designing buildings that created strong communities, the developments achieved lower turnover, reduced vandalism and crime, decreased maintenance costs, and higher tenant satisfaction. Residents who felt ownership in their communities took better care of shared spaces, mediated conflicts before they escalated, and created informal support networks that reduced the need for external social services. "The math is simple," James had explained to a group of investors considering funding his Minneapolis project. "Happy tenants stay longer, take better care of their homes, and create positive word of mouth that keeps vacancy rates near zero. Community infrastructure is profitable infrastructure." The policy implications were attracting attention from urban planners and housing advocates nationwide. Portland City Council had passed the Pemberton Housing Ordinance, requiring all affordable housing developments receiving city funding to include community spaces and programming. Oregon's state legislature was considering similar requirements, and congressional representatives were drafting federal legislation to incentivize community-centered development approaches. Sarah's role had evolved far beyond building management. As Director of Community Development for Pemberton Housing Solutions, she now split her time between the building that had started it all and consulting work that took her across the country. Her background in graphic design had proved unexpectedly valuable in this new role. She understood how visual communication could make complex community concepts accessible to residents, investors, and policymakers. Harold's genius wasn't just architectural, she'd explained during a presentation to the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington, D.C. He understood that community is a design challenge. You have to make it easy for people to connect, convenient for them to help each other, and natural for them to share resources. That requires the same kind of systematic thinking that goes into any good design project. Her consulting work involved helping other affordable housing developers understand how to implement Harold's principles in different contexts. Rural communities needed different solutions than urban high-rises. Developments for seniors required different programming than family housing. But the core insights remained constant: people needed spaces to gather, systems to share resources, and designs that assumed they wanted to know and care for their neighbors. The work was deeply satisfying but also emotionally demanding. Sarah had become a translator between worlds, helping architects understand community dynamics, teaching social workers about spatial design, and showing investors that caring about people could be profitable. She traveled constantly but always returned to her studio apartment in the Pemberton building, where her standing desk remained at its perfect height, exactly where Harold had insisted it belonged. The building had become a living laboratory for testing and refining community development strategies. Researchers from universities across the country made regular visits to study different aspects of its success. Sociologists documented the informal support networks that had emerged among residents. Economists analyzed the financial sustainability of the shared resource systems. Psychologists measured the mental health benefits of living in intentionally designed communities. What makes the Pemberton building unique, wrote Dr. Robert Kim, a housing policy researcher from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, is that it demonstrates how architectural design can address social problems that we typically try to solve through services or programs. Instead of providing counseling for isolated residents, the building design prevents isolation. Instead of organizing activities to bring neighbors together, the physical space makes casual interaction inevitable. The research attention had initially made some residents uncomfortable, but they'd gradually embraced their role as pioneers in a new approach to affordable housing. Their lived experiences were proving that Harold's 70-year-old vision could work in contemporary contexts, providing evidence that was changing policy discussions nationwide. The building's influence extended into unexpected areas. The shared tool library had inspired a citywide network of community resource sharing that reduced waste and increased access to expensive equipment. The informal skill sharing that happened naturally in the community workspace had led to Portland's first neighborhood university pilot program, where residents could teach and learn from each other in community-supported classes. Most unexpectedly, the building had become a model for aging in place. The intergenerational programming that had emerged organically, teenagers teaching elders about technology while learning traditional skills in return, had attracted attention. From gerontologists studying alternatives to isolated senior housing. Several residents who had planned to move when they retired had instead chosen to stay, finding that the community support network made aging more comfortable and dignified than traditional senior facilities. "I thought I'd have to move somewhere with medical support when I got older," explained Mrs. Patterson, now 78 and one of the building's longest-term residents. "But I have more support here than I'd have in any facility. My neighbors check on me, help with errands, and include me in their lives. Why would I leave my community for institutional care?" The evening light was beginning to slant through the community workspace windows as Sarah finished her work for the day. Around her, the space was transitioning from daytime work mode to evening community time. Dr. Okafor was packing up her coding workshop materials while the teenagers showed off their completed projects to proud family members. Felix was cleaning his brushes, the latest portrait addition to his building-wide mural still wet on the wall. Rosario was setting up tables for the weekly community dinner, a tradition that had grown from Harold's original vision of shared meals bringing neighbors together. As Sarah stood at her perfectly positioned desk, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. A broken standing desk had led to a ghostly encounter, which had revealed a forgotten architectural vision, which had inspired a family reconciliation, which had demonstrated a new model for community development, which was now influencing housing policy across the country. The building around her hummed with contentment, alive with the connections that made it more than just a place to live. Children's laughter echoed from the shared play areas Harold had designed but never seen realized. The sense of Rosario's cooking drifted from the community kitchen where neighbors were preparing dinner together. The soft murmur of conversation filled the workspace as residents wound down their day, many choosing to linger in the communal areas rather than retreat to their private apartments. Eleanor's presence seemed particularly strong this evening, a gentle spirit checking on the legacy she'd carefully cultivated for 50 years before entrusting it to Sarah's care. The building's former caretaker had understood what Sarah was only beginning to grasp, that some inheritances came with responsibilities that extended far beyond their original boundaries. "Well done," Sarah whispered into the evening air, feeling Eleanor's approving smile like a warm embrace. Outside her windows, the building settled into its evening rhythms, neighbors calling out greetings in the hallways, the sounds of shared dinners and collaborative projects, the comfortable bustle of people who'd learned to live as community rather than isolated individuals. The Pemberton building had become more than Harold's architectural dream realized. It had become a demonstration that home wasn't just a place you lived, but a place where you learned to live well with others. The standing desk sat at its perfect height, exactly as Harold had insisted, surrounded by the evidence of impossible dreams made beautifully, practically real. But it was no longer just Sarah's desk, it belonged to the community now, available to anyone who needed a place to work, to think, to create something that would benefit not just themselves but their neighbors as well. Harold's vision had been realized, but it was still growing, still evolving, still inspiring new possibilities for how people could live together. The building hummed with contentment, alive with the connections that made it more than just a place to live. It had become a place to thrive, to grow, to discover what people could accomplish when they had both the space and the support to become their best selves together. And somewhere in the quantum field fluctuations that Dr. Okafor's equipment continued to monitor, perhaps Harold's consciousness still lingered, not trapped now, but choosing to remain as a gentle presence in the building that had finally become everything he dreamed it could be. His impossible vision had become beautifully, practically, perfectly real. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.